Hi everyone and welcome to my Barrage Rogue Guide for Season 4. This is the build I've been playing the most so far and I've had a ton of fun with this. I leveled my first character of Barrage. It was the seasonal journey extra items set basically that you get from the start. And I was just kind of stuck with this all the way to level 100. And here as well I went back to it after trying out some other builds and I've been blasting the pit on some higher tiers. I went all the way to like around tier 80 or so with no trouble whatsoever. You see here I'm still blasting through those tiers actually with the damage output I have, and my gear is far from perfect. Most of the items here are masterwork to like 4 or 5 or so. I have like one greater affix here and there and that's about it. So nothing extraordinary. You can make this setup work just fine pretty early on and it has an absolute blast to play. So the main thing about this build is actually, it's just a typical combo points build that uses puncture to build the combo points and then barrage as a spender. And we make use of some of the new tools that we got from tempering, namely the extra imbuement count. You see this here right now. This is my cold imbuement here at the bottom. And I have like 8 charges of this or something like that. Whenever I activate it, I can just keep shooting those cold imbued arrows as much as I want. So this is really cool and it allows you to play like a full cold rogue, for example, or a full poison, a full shadow rogue. So this is what a lot of rogue builds use these days, including this one. This is something you can put on your rings and amulet as a resource temper. And other than that, the build doesn't really require much to function. There are like 2 skill-specific aspects. As I mentioned, you get them very early from just playing through the season, or if it's an alt, it's not that hard to get them. One of them is in the codex anyway. You can go do a dungeon and the build just works without really any big breakpoints, any necessary items. You can play it from the 1 all the way. Barrage is the archetype on rogue that I have played probably the most out of everything, and it just keeps coming back every season and it's just wonderful and really fun. Shooting into a big pack with all these arrows that now also pierce and then ricochet and then split into 2. You get like 50 hits per second or something and lots of numbers, lots of arrows, and it looks great just watching the spectacle. And you can do like this shotgunning into a single target on the boss, for example. If you stand really close to them, you can actually hit them with all of the arrows that usually extend in front of you in the cone. And you just try to like hit them with all of them at once and you get all these hits here. And it kind of deals with ads that are in a fight as well automatically because the arrows just automatically fly to them. So it does everything for you. You have a lot of cool outplay mechanisms with positioning in particular. Depending on where you stand and in which direction you shoot, you can either do more damage in like a cone and an AoE in front of you for like packs, or you can try to take down bosses by standing close to them. So I have the full updated planner here. There's also a few different variants. So I have the endgame pit variant. We have one with Uber Uniques, which is mostly just a Harlequin quest. Then we have the leveling and speed farming version. I just combined this because it turns out they're like just the same basically. And we have a bossing version in case you want to take down some of those tormented level 200 bosses. All in all, they're all very similar though. They all have kind of the same stuff. You maybe switch around a few skills or so and a few little details, but I kept the Paragon pretty much the same with the one exception that I changed one glyph here for leveling and speed farming, which is the exploit glyph instead of a diminished glyph here, but everything else is pretty straightforward, and as I mentioned, it kind of just works from the start. The main aspect that you want to get early on, which is also in the codex, is the branching volleys aspect. So this usually goes on the neck because it gives your barrage just way better AoE clear. This is useful in the hell tides that just have tons of density. AoE damage used to be kind of like the big weakness of Barrage. You just couldn't really get through large packs of monsters, and whenever there was a suppressor, whenever there was a champion that made everything have a lot of damage reduction, you would have trouble getting to them and actually taking them down. This has become a lot better with the buff of this aspect back in Season 3, and also the high velocity aspect now. This is a new one that gives you +1 pierce and extra attack speed for your Barrage. So with this extra pierce, you can get more shots, more arrows. In fact, both of those arrows, first the initial hit and then the pierced arrow, they both proc the branching volleys ricochets, and you just get like a lot of hits every time you fire. So when you use combo points, you fire 8 arrows. You can also go for a cunning stratagem board, which I've tried to get up to 10 arrows if you use this here, but I actually didn't in the end put it in the build. The main problem with this is that those extra arrows have a really large angle and you just miss most of them. So even when there's like a large pack of monsters, they have like a massive cone, and you just never really hit targets with that unless you're standing right on top of the enemies. So I didn't use Cunning Stratagem, and instead we made the Paragon board look like this. But you get 8 arrows, you get 16 hits with the pierces, and then they ricochet, like some of them is split, a 90% chance. So you get something like 30, 40 hits or something in a big pack of monsters. You may notice that there are some differences here with the elements as well that we have in the setup. So this is usually a cold imbuement build for the higher end stuff, and usually a shadow imbuement build for the lower end stuff. The reason why is that shadow imbue just doesn't really cut it anymore when you go to the high pits and to the high nightmare dungeons. It's just the explosions don't really matter anymore, basically. It's all about the damage of the arrows. There's not enough density, there's not enough like power in those explosions. But early on, this is actually very useful utility for just clearing packs. Whenever there's packs, you shoot a shadow imbued barrage in there, the pack will blow up, maybe the elite is left, you finish it off, you move on. So easy peasy. This is very good for Hell Tides, very good for leveling, but later on you go for cold, because cold just gives you more raw power, in particular through mixed cold imbuement. You get 40% extra damage when the target is frozen, which you can do with the cold imbuement itself by just hitting the target, and more importantly with tempers. So you can temper utility mods, chance to freeze. You can do this on all of your armor gear and the boots and even like other slots. But usually try to get like 1 or 2 of those freeze tempers, and like this you can activate Frigid Finesse easily. You can activate the cold imbuement easily and have a lot of burst damage. Also, when you stagger bosses, for example, and then you activate cold imbuement, you can do a lot of damage. This means that in the late game, you also want to prepare slightly different setups here, especially on your jewelry, because as I mentioned, there is this imbuement temper that you can get. Here's cold imbue, lasts for extra casts. Baseline, this is +2. You can try to get a masterwork crit on it, and then it gets to +3. This is kind of nice. You can put this on your rings and your amulet, and then you can have up to 11, for example, in the setup. Extra casts. This is a kind of overkill already, but it just makes it so that you barely ever have to activate your imbuements, basically, because it just lasts forever. So that's very nice. And in that case, there's one setup here with cold imbue and one with shadow. So if you can try to just have like a second round of jewelry ready and keep those around for whenever you do Hell Tides, for example. The rest of the setup is pretty straightforward. Puncture is kind of the standard generator here that gives us resources and slow and vulnerable. We also make stuff vulnerable every third cast here with improved barrage. So we don't really need stuff like extra vulnerable triggers from Exploit Glyph that much, or from the Shadow Imbuement, for example. Those are usually some good ways to get vulnerable. Not really required here, because we actually have a lot of attack speed. We have the high velocity, we have a rapid aspect here, and if you want, you can even put an accelerating. I have that here. This is optional, I would say, but in general, you have a lot of attack speed in the setup. So the combos are pretty fast. You shoot those barrages like every second or so, and most of the time stuff will be vulnerable just from that, for example. We have dash and shadow step. You're very mobile with this. You can use this as an unstoppable trigger, so you can go around really fast. You have dark shard here. A lot of people always ask me about this. This is not on a bar, but it's triggered from the Umbers aspect. So you get the free dark shrouds. We have a lot of crit chance and guaranteed crits even from precision. So it's very easy to trigger dark shrouds, and you just have a lot of defense this way. And down here we have like 1 point cold imbuement. There's not really a point in investing more ranks into cold imbuement, so if you happen to get that on your helm, forget about it. I would say it doesn't really help, so it's just like a 1 point wonder pretty much. And down here, key passive, the precision. So this is where you attack with your punctures, that stacks up the precision. And usually you do this 3 times to get the 3 combo points, and that usually gives you the 4 stacks of precision. And then you shoot a barrage and you get guaranteed crit with massive power. So the more critical strike damage you stack, the more you buff this key passive, giving you more damage on your combos. So you try to get as much crit damage as you can. See here all these items that can have it. There's the amulets with your offensive slots, the rings, the weapons, and the glove. You put critical strike damage temper from the marksman finesse recipe everywhere. And like this, you can stack ridiculous amounts of crit damage, as you can see here, buffing this precision key passive to the moon. And every time you do the combo here, you do a lot of damage. Because this is a combo point build, it's also very easy to sustain your resources. We have innovation here though to help us out a little bit. In particular for boss fights, this is useful because puncture does not actually generate resources when you're hitting an unstoppable target or a boss. You need to actually hit a target and it has to be slowed. Otherwise, puncture always regenerates a little bit of resources when you hit a crowd-controlled enemy, but this just helps us in those longer boss fights, basically. Early on, I would also recommend, for example, in leveling, you could put like a point or so in consuming shadows, because that just helps you out early on, get the resources high all the time before you get, you know, more stuff online, before you have more attack speed and so on. And most of the other aspects here are just pretty much straightforward, either defensive or offensive powers. So we have an edge masters on the crossbow. We want to use a crossbow because we attack with our melee weapons anyway to build our combo points. So most of our attacks use our melee weapons. And this means we can go for the slower crossbow for the big burst whenever you cast Barrage. You don't really want to use a bow for this, because bows have like around 20% less damage, and the downside or like the upside in attack speed is not really significant enough to make this worth it. So puncture plus crossbow is kind of the way here. Then we have a moonrise aspect, just extra attack speed and movement speed. You don't really care about the basic attack damage. Your puncture does nothing, but it's just like nice buffs. And we also have expectant here, gives us extra synergy with combo points. And this is pretty much the entire setup. You can swap around a few of these powers here. Not all of them are necessarily 100% required. Undying, for example, you can already heal just from siphoning strikes. You don't really need this. This could be another aspect. This could be, for example, a simulation for the Fortify or so. I also have Hectic here. This is also not required, but if you don't really have anything else to put, like a mobility aspect or maybe a Frostbitten you can do for some extra damage against frozen targets, you can do that. But I like Hectic a lot because, especially on the higher tier pit levels, it just makes it smoother to fight those bosses. You can't really stagger them that easily, and the bosses are by far the biggest problem. So I decided to not go for Frostbitten on this setup and go with Hectic. It just gives you more mobility and more uses of your dash, you know, more poison traps and these kind of things. Speaking of poison trap, you may be wondering, why is this in the setup? Well, one of the reasons is the 50% damage reduction. You don't really use Poison Trap all too often, especially in easier content, but at least for higher end stuff, you want to put it on the bosses, you want to put it maybe in an elite pack here and there, you get a damage reduction. Occasionally it also resets your imbuement, which means that your Hectic procs can go to other skills, which is nice. And we also have the synergy on the Paragon board, so we can dive into that here. We have the Deadly Ambush board for the extra crit damage to trapped enemies. And also we have the trapped enemy damage reduction here. We have the ambush glyph. So this is like the entire like trap board basically all in one with the ambush glyph as well. So we do a lot of extra damage. We take less damage, and it's very easy to sustain those buffs with the poison traps, because as long as the poison is ticking, you get all of these effects. For the rest of the Paragon board, there are a few other important legendary nodes. We have the exploit weakness, very easy to stack because you have many arrows, especially for bosses. This is very useful. You have Eldritch Bounty, since this is an imbuement-based build, you just get extra damage there. And we have the cheap shot here. So for nearby crowd-controlled enemies, we are generally kind of in close range. We get this effect quite often. And the rest is just stacking good glyphs. So we have Canny for the non-physical damage bonus. We have Combat, which you want to try to stack up a little bit for the extra crit damage. This helps with the precision scaling and gives us a bit of resources back, which is nice. We have Diminish here. This gives us a lot of damage reduction from slowed enemies, which you can apply from Puncture, and also maybe a temper. So you can have like a slow temper maybe on one of your items or so, but not really required. And lastly, we have Control here for extra damage to frozen enemies. And also we have a bunch of extra life nodes, damage nodes, and so on all over the place to make sure we have a lot of toughness. In this planner here, for example, I go to 51k life. And this is not really without any greater affixes on life either. There's like, you know, one maybe here or so, but nothing crazy. You can get a lot of life, and you kind of want it as well. I've been playing the higher tier pits, and you can easily get blasted there as a rogue. Rogues are just not that tanky. We try to build up as much defense as we can to make sure that we live. And 50k life is a pretty comfortable value. And that's it for the setup here. So hope you enjoyed this. It's pretty straightforward, as I mentioned. Go check out those different versions here in case you are still leveling, or in case you want to take some of those bosses and so on. There are some tweaks here and there, but ultimately pretty straightforward build. I had a lot of fun with Barrage. It's definitely up there as one of the better rogue builds, I think. I will be also trying more stuff. So for example, I've played Penshot and Rapid Fire already. I'm currently working on Heartseeker. So stay tuned for more of those guides as well. I'm working on those as well, and you can expect some in the next days to come. So hope you enjoyed this video here, and see you guys next time.